Hello everyone, and I'm really pleased to participate in this event explaining why voting over internet is the new way of voting, why it is inclusive, why it is democratic, why it is secure. So thank you very much for having me here and for the opportunity to discuss these issues. Victor was of course, correct to introduce me as the former Prime Minister, but in this context, it's perhaps even more important than that when the idea of internet voting came to life, I worked for the person who actually came up with the idea, the then Minister of Justice. And I was his advisor and assigned to actually make this from idea to the next step that can be introduced to the tech guys. But we will talk about this in a moment. Just before we go to the depths of internet voting, I will explain you a little bit more of Estonia. It's much better if the clicker actually would work, but we will come to the slides hopefully soon. Estonia is, as you know, a small country. Can somebody? Okay, this is working now. Estonia is a very small country of just 1.3 million people in the northeast corner of Europe. Of course, you do know where we are situated, and you probably also know that our population density is not very large. We are bigger than Denmark or Switzerland by territory, but we only have 1.3 million people living here. Why this matters? Well, there are people living in small villages. There are people living on small islands. We have 2,222 islands, and it's actually very difficult to get the public services to all those spots. So that's one reason why it actually makes sense to become a digital nation. The other reason, of course, is our history. 30 years ago, Estonia regained its freedom, its independence, and we needed to build our government, our institutions, our state, all the public services from the scratch. This means we needed to opt for the latest technology, the latest golden standards, and of course, 30 years ago, or to be exact 29 years ago, it was all about digital internet becoming the new thing and personal computers becoming much more affordable and usable. And ever since regaining our independence, we have been in a way stubborn to become number one, become the best in several things. Digital is only one of them. It's also economic freedom, and it's also many other things that are related to becoming as far as possible from the horrible Soviet occupation, the lack of freedoms, the society that was forced upon us for 5 decades. So, as said, for everything that we have been doing, there is, in my opinion, a logical explanation. And then the logical explanation is not that Estonians are all hackers, far from it. We are just very practical people who think that going digital is making sense, to put it mildly. Now, before we can talk about internet voting, we need to understand that it's all about the way we see the society. It's all about where the government services are going in the future, and I'm glad that Estonia figured that out quite quickly. Many of us are already globally using digital services, but most of those are actually private sector ones. We are getting our taxi by using an app. In Estonian case, it's Bolt app, a company that comes from Estonia. By the way, my daughter, who's 11, just last week, was amazed by the fact when I told her that we used to call somewhere to get ourselves taxi. And she actually needed explaining, how did you explain where you are and why didn't you use apps for that? And I think it's right to say that even our generation or people older than myself are actually using digital services in their everyday lives all the time. We use internet banking, we use paying with a credit card across the internet to buy stuff, and there are a number of things. But in most countries, for some reason, the politicians have been very hesitative to introduce public services, and this is exactly what I'm talking about here today. Estonian public services have all one important aspect in mind, and this is how it would be the most easy way to access for the citizens. So they are citizen-centric. We think, of course, always at the cost. We always think about efficiency, but we never think of anything before than how to make it easiest, most convenient for the citizen. We haven't introduced most of our digital services by the government alone. It's always, or almost always, public procurements, so that the government institution has an idea what needs to be done, what needs to be digitized. Sometimes also the idea comes from the private sector, but the implementation, the code writing, the making it happen almost always comes from the private sector, from ICT companies, whom we choose by public procurements. And of course, in today's world, in 21st century, in the year 2020, it goes without saying that good internet connection is extremely important. At the times of COVID, we have witnessed how important it is to have fast broadband connection across the country. And of course, it is, when it is there, it is actually also a very important enabler in terms of regional policy. You can actually live in the countryside and do most of the work from home. Of course, that given if your work permits to do that in this way. And the last point I want to illustrate on that is that in Estonia, all the citizens are in charge of their data as well. So as a government, if we collect some data about the citizens, they know what we collect. Let's say if we have health record or if we have a population register, the people themselves are in charge for that. But I'm not going too deep on that because we will reach the main topic, and this is internet voting. Now, as said before, going to vote on internet, and Victor was very right to mention that, we need to have other services to be digital as well, because if you only use digital ID for one service, then you tend to forget your PIN codes, then you tend to use other more convenient methods. But for the generation in this picture, I'm absolutely sure, and actually some people already older as well, I'm sure that everywhere in the world, digital will be the default way of getting public services. We don't need to go anywhere in the future to get any permits, to get any register, to get any declaration done. If you have a secure ID, then you can get any public service, any private service across the internet. Except a couple of examples. In Estonian case, the only important example is that we still cannot get married digitally. You need to show up for that, but I think it kind of makes sense to show up at your wedding anyways. It's a pity that I cannot ask you a question, or at least, okay, I can ask you a question, but I cannot get a response. But if I could ask you a question, I would ask you how many of you have seen my handwritten signature? And I'm pretty sure that Victor, perhaps Daniel, I'm not sure about Svenja, perhaps some of you have, but I'm sure that most of the audience has not. This is how it looks. Perhaps it doesn't. Because if you get a letter from me, if you get a contract from me, if you get I don't know, we don't use checks in Estonia, we have never used checks, but in many places of the world, still checks are used. And this is signed like that. reminding a bit my name. In some cases, the signatures don't remind the signer's name at all. And you just trust that, okay, this is probably signed by Taavi Rõivas. Using this highly technological tool to scribble something on a paper. I don't know if it sounds safe to you, but it doesn't sound safe to Estonians. I have been told that when I was around in second grade, 8-year-old, that some of my classmates actually falsified their parents' signatures in their diaries to get away from trouble. If the teacher gave them bad grades, they signed had something scribbled there like that reminded the name of their mother and got away from trouble because of that. So would you think that the criminals could ever falsify somebody's signature? Would it be difficult to do that? Well, as I can't hear your answer, I leave it there. The way Estonians have signed most of the time, it looks like that. Well, all you actually need to know here is that on the left side we have the documents or files of any kinds that have been signed, and on the right there is my name, when it was signed, exact time, and basically the only important thing you need to see is the green part is valid, so the signature is valid. On the top you see that I can, for signing I can use either ID card or mobile ID. We come to that quickly soon, but principally this is how it works. And if you need some more technical details, well, you can check those as well, but I assure you most people never do, and you actually don't need to. And of course, as in Moldova, as in many countries in the world, we use digital ID. Our version, this is actually 18 years old, and there are many other ways of doing that safely and securely, but this is the first we started with. You still need a computer to plug it in. We also use mobile ID, so basically that's the way to do it. It needs to be secure. That's the only thing. And in order to be secure, one part is usually physical, the other part is PIN code, two-way authentication. Very important to have the best available encryption, and voila. And of course, it helps if it's compulsory, if every citizen has it. If it's just a voluntary gadget, most people probably wouldn't have it and wouldn't use it. We made it compulsory to have it. It's the default document, and that made people to use that very often. And also we have X-road to connect different information systems, but I will skip that to get right to the point. Why we do have digital voting, internet voting in Estonia? Well, just like in Moldova, just like in Romania, just like everywhere in the world, most of our citizens don't live next to polling stations. As I said, many of our people actually live on, this particular picture is taken from a tiny island where just tens of people live. It's actually quite difficult to get the polling station up there. But even more importantly, many people, many Estonian citizens live abroad. I just today heard that from Victor that more than 200,000 people voted from abroad at the recent Moldovan presidential elections. Imagine if they could do it much more easily. Would there be even more people voting? And of course, it's also honest to say that small countries cannot afford to have embassies, even in all countries, yet alone in all cities. So I think internet voting is the only reason why we had Estonians voting from more than 140 countries. So it means that, you know, either you are living abroad or you just happen to travel. I know that during times of COVID, it seems ironic, but you know, in normal times we do travel a lot, and many people are traveling also at the date when the elections are held. So it only makes sense that they have opportunity to vote as well. Also, it is more inclusive for people living in Estonia who have, let's say, disabilities to move. yes, we do have a service that officials can come to your home and take your vote. But I mean, is it really reasonable if you can make it this way that you vote across the internet, you identify yourself securely, and you get the process done in just 2 minutes? Of course, it's easier to count the votes because you don't need people to look at different handwritings, compare them, put them in the ballots in the piles. It is much easier to calculate them in the computer. It needs to be, of course, 100% certain that the system is secure. As Victor explained, in Estonia, by constitution, it's also secret whom you voted for, whom I voted for, so nobody should see it. And the system that is counting the votes needs to be absolutely well built so that nobody can see whom I voted for, and it is secret for others. Now, how we do it? Again, Victor explained it a bit already, but the point is basically very similar to the most old school voting by mail. So in one envelope, this is all now digital, but you can understand it when I explain it very, very simply, just like the envelopes. In one envelope, you put the vote whom you voted for. This envelope does not have your name on it. This envelope does not have anything connected to you. Well, in the real world, it would have your fingerprints probably, but we assume that nobody is actually checking them. In the digital world, it doesn't even have your fingerprints. Then you take another envelope, which has your name on it, but nothing about whom you intend to vote or whom you voted for. This is the only thing that says that you have voted if they have collected this envelope. Now you put this envelope which has your name, you put this one inside the one that has your name, so the vote goes in this envelope, and at the time of the counting the votes, they are separated and they will never be connected back to each other again. This pile says who voted, this pile who got votes. And if there is, let's say, 1,000 votes here and 1,000 names here, you cannot connect them. And of course, in real world, there is more than 1,000 people voting for elections. It's also correct that we can re-vote however many times we want digitally. It's just like the envelope being destroyed and you get a new one, destroyed, you get a new one, and only the one that is valid or the latest will be calculated at the moment of calculating the votes. Why is that the case? Well, when we introduced internet voting, there was people skeptical. They said that what if there is a politician, let's say a social democrat, sitting behind my shoulder saying, Taavi, I will pay you 10 euros if you vote for me, and then you vote in front of this bad politician, and you get the 10 euros, and it's not the secretive voting. Well, in order to avoid that, we decided to make it this way that I can repeat my vote. So basically, if this bad social democrat behind my shoulder gives me 10 euros, looks that I vote for him, next day or in 2 hours, another bad politician, let's say this time it's a conservative, watches over my shoulder, I vote for him, I get 10 euros. Again, now I have already 20 euros. The Social Democrat thinks that I voted for him. The Conservative thinks that I voted for him. And then I go home in my own computer. Nobody sees, but of course I will vote for the Liberal politician. And as you can understand from this very simplistic example, no politician is so stupid to actually give me this 10 euros because they know that I can re-vote many times over. And in today's world, actually, I would argue that voting conventional way, where you only get your one ballot, is less secretive because you can take your phone camera, you can take a picture, and you can show it to somebody giving you some goods for that in return. Of course, that would be highly illegal, but I think it is more possible in the physical world, voting with a paper ballot, than it is in the internet world. So that's why I argue that internet voting is actually more secure and more secretive as well. In Estonia, we have had internet voting ever since 2005. The idea actually came to life already in 2000, 2001, but it took us a lot of time to first introduce the legislation, and second, we didn't even have ID cards when the idea actually came. And the idea why it came first was that we were already planning to introduce digital identity for all Estonians, and the question was raised, which is the most important, most valuable public service or public or the action that the citizen can do digitally. And then, the decision was taken that there is nothing more important in a relationship of the government and the person or the citizen than voting, than expressing your democratic will. And the kind of idea behind that was, if voting can be digitally, then anything, any public service can be made digital. And yeah, that's exactly how it is. Victor already mentioned, as a resident of Estonia, as a person who uses Estonian public services, he uses digital all the time, and I assure you, so do I, especially during the times of pandemic, especially when you live on a distant place, it's so much more convenient, but also in the normal times, also when you live in the center of the capital. We believe in Estonia that it's actually easier to access digitally your computer and to get those services from the government than to physically go somewhere to fill in some formula, to wait in line to get to the embassy or public office to submit a declaration or to vote. You can spare all that and you can do it with less hassle, less time-consumingly, and hopefully then more people do this, especially in the voting, where the voters' turnout is extremely important, so that the politicians elected actually represent the citizens. But having said that, there needs to be, of course, at least some sort of alternative as well. There are people, even in Estonia, who don't use computers or who don't want to use computers. This is like not as big as an issue today as it used to be 20 years ago, because today most people in the world have smartphones, which are also computing devices, which can also be used as tools for identification. But still, there are people who don't want to use computers or who don't know how. And for that, we still have an option to get your services manually as well, just as the banks still have a few offices where you can actually go and get your money in cash. But most of the people, vast majority of the people, are opting for digital services because it just makes sense and it's so much more convenient. In elections, there are still people who want to go to polling stations. They know this is very symbolic, very ceremonial. Politicians love to go to polling stations because they can cast their vote very, very slowly, so that pictures have been taken. Well, I assure you, even politicians can get their moments. This is a picture of me voting, having a lot of media in my office. I deliberately didn't go to the office or to the polling station because I'm a strong believer in internet voting, and media came anyways to take some pictures, so I got my moment of fame. And the last point I want to make is that I recently followed very closely an election across Atlantic Ocean, of course, the US presidential election. And it was so frustrating to wait for days and days to see the results coming. And I remember that in 2015, when I was waiting for the election results as a sitting prime minister to know whether I can continue my job as prime minister, whether my party has won or not, then it took me frustrating 40 minutes, or not me, but from the votes to be counted. It was 40 minutes, and it already seemed like eternity. And in 40 minutes, we had the first 40% or however many people voted electronically, votes calculated. And I think, in comparison, it actually does make sense to do it this way. With that, I thank you very much. And as Victor said, there is also room for some short questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taavi, very much. And we have on our workshop platform a number of questions. Unfortunately, we have just 4 minutes for that. So the first question is very interesting, because actually I wanted to ask you this. So what you will do on the topic of I-voting if you were the Prime Minister of Moldova starting now?
Well, I have no ambition to become Prime Minister of any country, but that's not Estonian, and I have been in Estonia already. But if I would do that, I would definitely introduce digital services. I would definitely offer people more use of the digital identity, as I understand is already available in Moldova. And I don't think that the internet voting should be the only digital service that Moldova should introduce, but it should definitely be one of those, because I hope I made this point understandable, that there are so many logical reasons why internet voting is actually more inclusive, more secure, cheaper, and makes sense.
Thank you very much. And we have another question, because we are upvoting here. Participants are voting. And now the number 2, it's in a long run. How did the introduction of internet voting has affected the costs to organize the elections in Estonia?
Well, as I said, it's around 3 times cheaper to organize voting over the internet. But to be honest, we still need to have the physical polling stations as well. They are simply a bit less effective, as there is less people going there. There is less people that we need for counting. So I don't even know how much it actually saves money, and whether it does save us a little bit. It would save us a lot of money if we would organize only in the internet. Where it saves us a lot of money is, of course, that there is almost no people voting by mail anymore, and all the people living outside of Estonia can so conveniently vote that the kind of burden on our embassies is much less than it would be otherwise. And a small country, as I said, we cannot afford having pop-up election stations like France has, for example. We cannot do that. We just don't have the resources for that. And luckily, with e-voting or internet voting, we just can have all our people, wherever they live, wherever they are at the moment of election, they can participate.
Taavi, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.